The last town she recognized disappeared past the train window somewhere around Swift Current. And after that, it was just sky, enormous and pale and flat, all the way to where the world ended. She kept her coat on for warmth and her hands folded in her lap and watched the prairie move past, the dry grass pressed sideways by a wind she couldn't hear through the glass, the soil pale and cracked along the track's edge. November had already made its intentions clear. She had the advertisement in her coat pocket. She had read it enough times to have it by memory. Widow or capable woman sought. Work will be hard. Honest pay and winter board. Reply to Box 14, Dunbar Post Office, Saskatchewan District. But she took it out anyway and smoothed it against her knee. The handwriting was careful. Not elaborate, just careful. The kind that came from a person who chose their letters deliberately and didn't waste them on flourish. She had thought that meant something when she answered. She still thought so. Her husband had been gone 14 months. He had gone the way men sometimes went on the farm, a thing that looked manageable in the morning and wasn't by nightfall. She had paid the doctor and then paid what she could of the rest and signed over what she couldn't and walked out of the land title office with her trunk, her sewing basket, and the particular quiet that settles over a person when there is nothing left to decide. Her sister in Hamilton had taken her in for the winter, and then the spring, and then the summer. And somewhere in the middle of the 2nd September, her sister had stopped pretending not to worry. That was when she had answered the advertisement. The train pulled into Dunbar at 3:15, and the wind came with it, low and sharp off the open plain. The platform was a plank walkway with a single bench and a tin roof that rattled in the gusts. She stepped down with her trunk and set it by the bench and stood with her sewing basket and looked at the town. There was a grain elevator to the north, a water tower, a main street that ran perhaps 4 blocks. The buildings were mostly wood, some with false fronts that added 2 feet of height and a foot of ambition. A general store, a livery, a post office squeezed between a hardware and what looked like a barber shop. She counted 7 people visible in the street, none of them moving toward the platform. She sat on the bench and waited. The advertisement had said he would meet the train. She waited 20 minutes by the clock she could see through the post office window. Then she waited 10 more. The wind found the gap between her collar and her toque, and she pulled the wool down over her ears. She took out the mending she had started on the train, a shirt cuff that had frayed along the fold, and worked it slowly, not because it needed care, but because her hands needed something to do, and her face needed something to arrange itself around. At the half hour, a man came out of the livery across the street and stood looking at the platform. He was broad through the shoulders, wearing a sheepskin coat that had seen several winters, his hat low against the wind. He looked at her trunk first, then at her. He crossed the street without hurrying, and she put the mending away. He said her name, the last name only, as a question. She said yes. He said he had been held up at the smithy, that a trace chain had snapped that morning, and he needed it before the ground froze any harder. He said it plainly without apology, but also without the false ease of a man trying to make light of something. She registered that without comment. He said the wagon was around the side of the livery. She picked up one end of her trunk. He took the other, and they carried it together without discussion. He loaded it in the wagon bed, and she climbed up onto the board seat, and he handed her a wool blanket without being asked. The livery boy, a thin 12-year-old named Percy, watched them from the doorway with open curiosity. Neither of them acknowledged him. The road north was frozen and rutted and ran straight through grass that had gone gray and low for the season. On both sides, the land opened up in a way she was still learning to take in. Flat and enormous, the sky pressing down at the edges in a way that felt like it wanted to be taken seriously. She kept her back straight and her eyes on the road ahead and watched the light move on the snow that had settled in the low places, pale blue in the shadows. She said it was a long way out. He said 4 miles, give or take. He said it without looking at her, which she didn't mind. She was busy looking at the land herself. The homestead came into view on a long rise. She saw the house first, low and unpainted, a porch along the front that had been built solid and then left to weather, a windmill turning slow. Behind the house, what was left of the barn, 3 walls and part of a roof, the south-facing wall gone entirely, open to the sky like a box with its lid torn off. The structure had been shored up with new timber on the inside. She could see the raw yellow of fresh-cut wood from the road, but it was not a barn anymore. It was a framework with a heavy tarp lashed across the open side, and it would not keep anything warm. She kept her face forward. He pulled the team to a stop in the yard. He got down first, and then came around and stood at the wheel while she climbed down herself. He didn't offer his hand, and she didn't want him to. He stood and let her look at the barn the way a man stands near something he knows is wrong and has been looking at for too long to see clearly anymore. She said, "What happened to it?" He said lightning in August. He said the north corner, caught first, and by the time he got the cattle out, the whole south wall was gone. He said it the way a man says something he has had to explain more than once and has stripped down to facts only. She asked how many cattle. He said 11 head. He said 2 were older cows that might not hold the winter even with shelter, that he had been watching them. He said the tarp kept the wind off but not the cold. She nodded once and looked at the tarp, the way the near edge had worked itself loose at the bottom and was lifting in the current. She looked at the timber shoring and counted the uprights and noted where the new wood met the old. He brought in her trunk and set it in the small room off the kitchen. She stood in the doorway and looked at the room. A cot with a wool blanket, a nail above the door holding nothing, a window on the north wall with a board nailed across the bottom where the sill had rotted. The board was clean. He had planed it and fitted it neatly. She noted that. The kitchen had a cook stove with a firebox that drew unevenly. She could tell from the scorch marks on the ceiling around the flue, but someone had cleaned the flue collar recently. The shelf held flour, salt, a small can of lard, and a tin of baking powder. There was no lamp on the table, only a lantern hung on a hook by the door. She moved it to the table. He watched her do this from the doorway. She asked if he had coffee. He said there was some in the tin above the stove. She found it and put the pot on. He sat at the table. She stood at the stove, and they waited for the water together, in the particular quiet of 2 people who don't yet know what to say to each other and have both decided there is no hurry. She served him a cup and took her own and stood at the window. The sun had gone low, and the yard was blue with the early dark. The tarp on the barn was lifting at the corner again, rhythmically, like something breathing. She said she would look at the tarp first thing tomorrow. He said he had rope. She said she would need a ladder too. He said there was one in the yard. Outside, the wind moved through the yard in long, low pulls, and neither of them said anything else for a while. The stove ticked. The lantern on the table threw a steady light across the pine. In the morning, she was up in the dark and had the stove going before the sky showed any color at the eastern edge. She found eggs in the cold box outside the kitchen door, 6 in a crock, and a piece of salt pork hanging from a hook in the larder. She made what she could of it. She heard him in the barn at first light, his voice low and even, talking to the animals the way a man does when he thinks no one can hear him. He came in and stopped when he saw the plate on the table. He ate without speaking, and she stood at the window with her coffee. The light came up gray and flat over the snow in the pasture. Out at the barn, she could see one of the older cows standing near the tarp, her head low. After he went out, she took the rope from the nail by the barn door and climbed the ladder to the roof edge and worked the tarp back into the cleats he'd fitted at the top. The wind fought her for 10 minutes. She won, eventually, by moving methodically from east to west, not trying to hold it all at once. When she came down, her hands were stiff and the tips of her fingers had gone past cold into something that felt like burning. She worked them against each other until the feeling came back. She checked the coop next. 9 hens, water pan iced at the edges, feed running lower than she'd want. She broke the ice with her knuckle and noted the feed without saying anything to anyone. That afternoon, she went through the kitchen stores the way she always began in a new place, not looking for abundance, just looking for the truth of the thing. The flour would last 3 weeks at careful use. The salt pork was nearly gone. The coffee tin was half full. She found a sack of oats behind the door, a jar of dried beans, 2 tins of tomatoes. No butter, No sugar, though there was a ring on the shelf where a tin had sat. She noted each item without alarm. She found the account book on the shelf beside the stove. She didn't open it. She noted where it was and left it alone. He came in at dusk with the cold still on him, his coat dark at the shoulders from the wet of the day. He washed at the basin and sat down, and she put supper in front of him. She ate standing at the stove, the way she had learned to do in the first days at a new place, until she understood how a house ran and where she fit inside it. He noticed. He didn't say anything about it. After supper, he said the two older cows were thin and that he had been concerned about them since the barn fire. He said he had been trying to keep them on the better hay, but the hay was running lower than he'd planned. He said it without asking for anything, the way a man who has been solving his own problems for a long time sometimes speaks, out loud but not quite to anyone. She said she had seen them. She said there might be a way to extend the hay if they added straw underneath and kept the tarp tight, that the cows would eat less if they were warmer. He looked at her across the table with the particular attention of a man who has just recalculated something without deciding yet what to do about the new number. He said he had thought about the straw. She said she could show him how she had done it before, on her husband's farm. The words came out the way they always did now, without catching on anything going out. Only the return of them after caught a little. He didn't say he was sorry. She didn't want him to. By the third week, the temperature dropped in a serious way. The kind of cold that came off the northern prairie like it had an opinion and meant to share it. The tarp held, but she checked the fittings every morning, and he checked them every evening, and neither of them mentioned to the other that this was what they were doing. She had laid straw 3 inches deep along the barn floor and banked it against the base of the shoring timbers, and the older cows stood in the sheltered corner without any encouragement. In the 4th week, on a Wednesday night, the younger of the 2 old cows went down. She heard him at 2 in the morning, his boots on the kitchen floor, the lantern scraping off the hook by the door. She was up before he reached the yard. She found him kneeling in the straw with the lantern set at his side and the cow flat and breathing shallow, her eyes half closed. He had his hand on her flank. He did not look up when she came in. She knelt on the other side. She put her hand on the cow's neck and felt the heat there, which was too much heat, not warmth. She asked how long she had been down. He said he had checked at midnight and she was standing. She asked if he had drench. He said there was some in the tack room. She got it, and they worked through until 4 in the morning, she and him taking turns with the lantern and the drench bottle and the watching. The other cattle stood against the far wall, their breath rising in white columns. The barn was cold, but not as cold as the yard. Outside, the wind moved in long, slow pulls. At 4:30, the cow raised her head and took interest in the water bucket. He sat back on his heels and let out a breath that had been in him for a while. She put the drench bottle away and straightened up and felt the cold in her knees from the straw. She looked at the tarp, then at the timber shoring, then at the cattle along the wall. Everything where it should be. He said, without looking up, that he had been afraid of losing her since October. She said 2 months was a long time to carry something. He looked up then. She was already turning back toward the house. She walked in across the cold yard with her breath ahead of her and her hands balled at her sides. The kitchen was warm from the banked stove, and she put the kettle on and stood at the window and watched the dark over the pasture, the snow still and blue in the small hour before dawn. She thought about her husband the way she sometimes did when she was very tired. Not with grief exactly, not anymore, but with the particular kind of missing that didn't need anything from her, just visited and then went. The day she went to town was a Thursday in early December. She had the list in her coat pocket, 6 items written in pencil on the back of an old envelope. The wagon road to Dunbar was frozen solid, and she could see all the way to the water tower from the first rise. The woman behind the counter at the general store was called Mrs. Polly, and she had the manner of someone who had watched the district through its various seasons and formed careful opinions about all of it. She looked at the list without touching it. She said whose account. She gave the name and the quarter section. Mrs. Polly looked at the list again and then looked at her. She said the account had not been touched since September. She said there was a balance still owing from the summer. She set the list on the counter between them and did not hand it back. She looked at the list. She looked at the 6 items. The lamp wicks she could stretch another week. The sugar she could do without entirely. The baling wire she had to think about. The tarp fittings would work loose again before spring, she was nearly certain, and the wire was cheap insurance. The nails for the barn shoring she had been putting off adding to any list. But 2 of the timber joints were working apart, and she had felt them move when she leaned her weight on the shoring that morning. She crossed out the sugar. She crossed out the lamp wicks. She stood with the pencil over the nails for a moment. She crossed those out last. It cost her something, though she didn't show it. She pushed the list back across the counter. Mrs. Polly looked at what remained: flour, baling wire, salt. She said she could do that against the account. She wrapped the flour in brown paper and tied the wire into a coil and set the salt on top. Then she looked at her for a moment longer than necessary. She said, "I heard there was someone out there helping him keep the place." She said, "I'm working through the winter, cooking and keeping the house." Mrs. Polly nodded in the slow way of a woman who has already assembled her own understanding of a situation and is merely confirming the final details. She didn't say anything more after that. On the walk back, she thought about the nails. She thought about the 2 joints in the barn shoring and how long a person could look at a thing that needed doing before the looking became its own kind of weight. She shifted the bundle to her other arm and kept her pace steady. The homestead was below her on the last rise, smoke from the chimney, the yard still in the pale afternoon light. He was at the barn when she came down. Not beside it, in it, working at the shoring by the sound of it. She set the bundle on the kitchen table and went back out. She stood at the open side of the barn and watched him. He had a tobacco tin of nails and was driving them into the joint with the flat back of his hatchet, one at a time, working carefully. No coat. His flannel shirt was dark at the shoulders with the cold sweat of effort. He did not look up until she was nearly beside him. He said, "Mrs. Polly mentioned the list." She said she wasn't obliged to do that. He drove another nail, he said. "The nails were mine to sort, not yours." She said nothing. He said, "I'll go in at the end of the month with a cord of wood. There'll be enough to settle the account and some besides." She said, "Good." Went back to the nail. She watched him drive it flush in 2 strokes. She picked up the baling wire from the barn entrance and went to work on the tarp fittings at the east corner, which had been worrying her all week. That evening, the temperature dropped hard after dark, and the wind came from the northwest and found every gap in the kitchen walls with a seriousness she had not heard in it before. She packed rags into the worst places around the door frame and the window casing on the north wall. He came in from the last check of the barn and stood warming his hands at the stove without speaking. After supper, he sat with his coffee the way he sometimes did in the evenings. Not drinking it right away, just holding the cup in both hands, working something through. She worked on a pair of his socks that had worn through at the heel, darning by lantern light. Outside, the wind ran along the eaves in long, low pulls. He said, "The cow is still up." She said, "I know." He said, "You were out there most of the night." She said, "We both were." He was quiet for a moment. He set the cup down. He said, "When I wrote the advertisement, I thought I was asking for someone to manage the kitchen and keep the accounts while I got through the winter." He stopped. He said, "I was wrong about what I was asking for." She looked up from the darning. He said, "You've been keeping this place alive since November. The tarp and the straw and the drench and the nails you crossed off the list." He said it with the plainness he used for most things, which she had come to understand was not the absence of feeling, but the shape his feeling took. She said, "You kept it alive before I came." He looked at the window at the dark where the yard was. He said, "Barely." She set the sock on the table. She said, "The work wasn't what I expected either." He looked at her then. She said, "I expected to manage. I didn't expect to." She stopped and looked at the lantern for a moment. She said, "I had stopped expecting much of anything." She said it without complaint, only as the plain fact of the thing. He pushed back his chair. He stood and didn't go anywhere. He stood the way a man stands when he has arrived somewhere and isn't quite sure yet of the ground beneath him. She stood too. Not quickly, the way you stand when there is no hurry and the room is small and the distance between two people doesn't need to be dramatized. She put her hand out and pressed it flat against the front of his shirt, just above the pocket, the way you test something before you decide to trust it. His heart was there, steady and particular and real. Put his hand over hers. Just that, just held it there, warm in the cold room. The wind went on outside. The lantern burned low on the table. Neither of them moved to turn it up. February came, and the cold came with it. A hard month, no softening anywhere. The two old cows held. One morning she found a fresh row of boards nailed along the base of the kitchen wall on the north side, replacing the rotten ones she had been watching since December. She hadn't mentioned them to him. She stood in the kitchen and looked at the boards, neat and close-fitted, the wood still pale, and then she turned around and made breakfast. He came in from the barn and poured his coffee and didn't say anything about the boards either. March arrived with a thaw that lasted 4 days, and then a hard freeze that undid most of it, the way prairie springs like to remind you not to trust them. She had started seeds in a wooden flat near the south window. He watched her tend them each morning without comment, and once she caught him looking at them in the afternoon when he didn't know she was in the doorway. The same way he looked at the cattle sometimes, checking, calculating, carrying a quiet kind of responsibility for things that couldn't speak. Spring came the way it came on the Saskatchewan plain. Not with warmth at first, but with light. The days longer, the snow pulling back from the south-facing banks, the cattle moving farther into the pasture where the grass showed pale and new beneath the melt. The older cow, the one that had gone down in November, stood in the south corner of the pasture on a Saturday morning in April with her head up and her ears forward. She hadn't carried herself like that since before the fire. He was at the fence, and she was at the barn door, and they both saw it at the same moment. He turned and looked at her across the yard, and she looked back, and that was enough. A woman from the farm to the south stopped on the road one afternoon in May and called out that the place was looking well. She said she had heard from more than one person that the quarter section south of the creek was the best managed land in the district. She said it with the careful emphasis of a woman measuring exactly how much she wants to say. She thanked her and kept moving. That evening she was putting the supper things away when she heard the sound of planing from the porch, the long, rhythmic scrape of it. She stood in the kitchen doorway and listened. He was working the porch boards that had gone soft over the winter, planing them back to clean wood, moving from east to west, one board at a time. She went back inside and set the table. She put the lamp where the light fell best and filled 2 cups and waited. He came in and washed his hands at the basin and looked at the table. He sat down. She sat across from him. Outside, the light was going soft over the pasture in the long way it did that time of year, slow and generous with itself. The sky holding its color well past when you expected it to let go. Cattle moved in the south field, quiet and unhurried. The windmill turned. The porch smelled of new wood. They ate. They didn't talk much, and what they said was small. The north fence, the seedlings nearly ready for the ground, whether the well had settled back to its usual depth after the melt. The lamp burned steady. After a while, neither of them spoke at all, and the quiet between them was the kind that does not need filling, the kind that 2 people arrive at the long way around, through all the things that were harder than expected and turned out to be survivable, through a winter that had asked more than either of them had been prepared to give and had been met anyway. One cold morning at a time, together.